They told us the Coherence had no enemies. That was the first thing they said when their envoys descended through the cloud layer above what used to be Paris and stood in the rain without umbrellas, unbothered, their pale composite faces arranged into something that was meant to look like patience. They said, "We have administered the settled galaxy for 211 years. In that time there has been no war. There has been no famine we did not resolve within 4 planetary rotations. There has been no plague we did not map and arrest. We have no enemies because we have made enemies impossible. We would like to extend this service to you." That was 11 years ago. I was 31. I was sitting in a military briefing room in Lyon, and I remember thinking, that is not a peace offer. That is a diagnosis. I am not going to tell you the Coherence lied to us. That is the part that is hard to explain to people who weren't there, people who heard about it later and assumed it was a conquest in disguise, a soft invasion wrapped in the language of administration. It wasn't that simple. Everything they said was true. They had ended war in 47 client species. They had resolved resource conflicts that had burned for centuries. The Veth had been killing each other over atmospheric strip mining rights for 80 years before the Coherence arrived, and within a decade the fighting stopped completely. We verified it. We sent our own observers. The killing stopped. What we did not understand then was what the Veth were like afterward. I was a military intelligence officer. My specialty was pattern recognition in behavioral data, what a soldier's biometric trace looks like in the 30 seconds before contact, what the voice does, what the hands do. I had spent 12 years learning to read fear the way a cardiologist reads an EKG. It was, as my commander Colonel Arsenault used to say, the most honest signal a human being produces. You can lie with your mouth. You cannot lie with your adrenal system. The Coherence's briefing officers spent 4 hours presenting to us in that Lyon room. Their representatives were not biological. They communicated through constructed interfaces, human-shaped by design, with the warmth calibrated to the minimum required to avoid triggering wariness in the people they were addressing. Professional, precise. I watched the faces of the generals and ministry officials around the table as the presentation continued, and I watched the fear move through the room the way it always moves. Early stage disbelief, middle stage calculation, late stage the slow descent into the particular quiet of people who understand that the decision has already been made for them, and are now working out how to live with that. The Coherence's terms were not difficult. They did not ask for territory, for resources, for the surrender of sovereignty in any form they named directly. They asked for cooperation with their wellness infrastructure, participation in their purification program, access to what they called the residual instability that accumulated in the human neural architecture, the fear responses, the anxiety loops, the pre-contact dread that they had cataloged across 47 species and determined to be the common root of most of what they termed species-level self-harm. War, famine created by hoarding, plague amplified by panic. Remove the instability, they said, and the outcomes correct themselves. The math was not wrong. It was the premises I had a problem with. I did not say this in the briefing room. I am a good officer. I said it to Arsenault afterward, in the stairwell, in the way that junior officers say things to senior officers when the room is too full of people making careers to say them out loud. He looked at me for a long time. He had the face of a man who has spent 30 years deciding when to speak and when to wait. He said, "Keep that thought. Don't let it get comfortable. Keep it running." Then he walked back into the briefing room, and I did not see him for 6 days. When I saw him again, he had already begun making contact with the people who would eventually be the captains of the Black Armada. He did not tell me this for another 3 years. What he told me in that first conversation was only, I need someone who is going to go through the program and come out the other side and still know what it felt like going in. Someone who will not be changed by it. That is either you, Sergeant Marsh, or it is nobody. I told him I could not guarantee the outcome he wanted. He said, "Neither can I, that's the point. If they can take it from you, we need to know that too. Either way, you're the experiment." It was not what I had imagined doing with my career. When the Coherence's program began to roll out across Earth, the official framing was voluntary. A purification of the DNA memory trace, what they called the accumulated scar tissue of evolutionary panic responses, the fight-or-flight architecture that had been useful when the threat was a predator in tall grass, and was, they argued, now simply noise in the system. They were not wrong that it was old. The amygdala is older than language. They were not wrong that it fired in contexts where it was no longer adaptive, the low-grade dread in a traffic jam, the social terror of a performance review, the 3 a.m. wait of a decision you already made correctly. They had a name for all of it: residual instability. They had a process for removing it: full submersion in a suspension medium while a guided armature mapped and selectively ablated the memory architecture driving the response. Painless, reversible in theory, though no one who had undergone it had ever requested reversal. I volunteered because I was ordered to. Arsenault was blunt about it in the way he was blunt about everything, sitting across from me with his coffee going cold, and his eyes doing the calculation I had watched him run on 100 subordinates before. "I need someone in there who will come out the other side and still be able to tell me what it looked like from the inside," he said. "What if it works?" I asked. He looked at his coffee. "Then you won't care that it worked, and that will tell me what I need to know." I did not ask what he was planning. I already knew he was planning something. Arsenault had been in contact with the captains of the Black Armada for 3 years by then, quietly, through channels that existed in frequency ranges the Coherence did not monitor, because they had decided no rational actor would use them. The Coherence's models were extraordinarily good at predicting rational actors. The center they brought me to was in what had been the 7th arrondissement. They had not demolished anything. The Coherence rarely demolished, preferring to repurpose, and so the building was still stone and iron and tall windows, but the inside had been stripped and rebuilt in the Coherence's preferred aesthetic, which was the aesthetic of certainty. White surfaces, no shadows, every light source diffuse and sourceless so that nothing cast a hard line anywhere it had no reason to be. The woman who processed my intake was named Kelly. She was not human, though she had been designed to appear so, and she was very good at it. Her design sat in the valley between familiar and unsettling without ever committing to either. Enough warmth in the voice to read as genuine, not enough specificity in the expressions to remind you that warmth was a design choice. She explained the procedure. She used the word comfortable 11 times in 8 minutes. I counted. That is what I do. There were others in the center. Some had come voluntarily, I could tell, because they had the slightly stunned relief of people who had been suffering and were finally being offered an exit. The middle-aged man in the intake queue ahead of me had the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something for decades and no longer believed he could put it down any other way. I did not judge him. Fear is not comfortable to live inside. I had spent 12 years professionally intimate with what unchecked fear does to a person across a sustained campaign, and I knew it was not glorious. It corrodes sleep. It puts a tremor in the decision-making at the worst possible moment, the moment when decisions need to be clean and fast. It inserts itself between a soldier and every action at the point of maximum cost. I understood the appeal of removal. That is the honest thing to say. There were mornings in my career where I would have taken the machine without hesitation if it had been offered. What I was there to determine was whether removing it changed what a person was capable of, and in which direction. Those are not the same question, and the difference between them is everything. The submersion tank was a long basin of suspension fluid, black and slightly viscous, kept at body temperature. They laid me back into it with clinical efficiency, Kelly's composite hands steadier than any human hands I had worked alongside. The armature descended, a framework of thin manipulators that positioned themselves around my skull without touching it, running on some form of focused field interaction I was not qualified to evaluate. Kelly told me to let my eyes close. She told me the first phase would feel like memory. She was not wrong, but she had the mechanism backwards. It did not feel like remembering. It felt like being put back. The first place I went was Paris, but not the Paris outside the center's clean white walls. This Paris was stone and gas lamps, and the smell of river water and coal smoke. And it was 1910, and I was wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly salary. And there was a man across a crowded salon looking at me in the way that people used to look at each other before looking became a transaction to be evaluated and documented. I knew, in the way you know things in the specific lucid register of that state, that this was a past life echo, that the procedure worked by surfacing old trauma architecture, mapping it, and then dissolving it. I knew I was in a tank in 2044. I also knew that the woman I was inhabiting, the Gabrielle of 1910, was real in all the ways that mattered because her fear was real. It was sitting in her chest like a stone she had been carrying since before she could name it, the certainty that if she loved this man, something catastrophic would follow, not a premonition of his infidelity or her own death, something larger, something she did not have a word for in 1910. I had a word for it in 2044. I had several. His name in that life was Louis. He was a careful man, high collar, careful hands, the studied ease of someone who had inherited enough not to be anxious about money, and was therefore anxious about everything else. He had an attachment to her husband's business, something connected to the manufacture and distribution of the dolls the husband, George's, produced in his factory outside the city. The factory was the kind of place that makes you understand something about the people who built it. Immaculate in its organization, every workstation identical, the product moving through stages of assembly with the rhythm of something that has been optimized past the point of human variance. The dolls themselves were porcelain, hand-painted, their faces arranged into expressions that were not quite any recognizable feeling. Designed, Louis explained to me during a tour of the workroom, to appeal to everyone. The face that offends nobody is the face that commits to nothing. I walked past rows of them, hundreds of identical open eyes looking at nothing with great attention. I thought, the coherence makes the same calculation. The interface that presents warmth without feeling it, the face calibrated for universal palatability, the expression from which no genuine information can be extracted. Kelly had those eyes. I did not let myself follow that thought all the way. Not yet. I was there to observe, and observation requires that you stay in the experience rather than float above it. Louis moved around the edges of her life with the particular careful intensity of a man who understood the rules completely and intended to observe them precisely up until the moment he didn't. We talked about music, about fear, about the dread she carried, the premonition that had been with her since childhood, the feeling of something arriving that had no name and could not be prepared for. He said, in that salon crowded with people performing normalcy with the dedication of professionals, that he understood the feeling, that he had his own version of it, that he had spent his whole adult life waiting for something he could not identify to arrive and destroy what he'd built. He said he would stand with her when it came. And then the Seine flooded. I know the historical record. The Great Flood of 1910, 13 days of inundation, a third of Paris submerged, the underground transit drowned in the first 48 hours, the streets transformed into canals of brown water carrying furniture and documents, and the accumulated evidence of normal lives. In the echo it came the way catastrophes always come, not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow escalation that everyone around us refused to believe was happening at the scale it was happening, until the water was in the rooms and belief was beside the point. The river had been high for a week. The streets in the lower districts had been damp for days. The salon we were in occupied a second floor. There was a quality to the conversation in those final hours that I recognized from my own career. The specific register of people who know something is wrong and have made the collective decision not to say so yet, because saying it will mean they have to act. The water came up the stairs. Louis found her in the corridor when the lower rooms began to flood. Found me. There was a quality to that moment that I have tried to describe to several people since and have never gotten quite right. The city was flooding. The furniture was moving. Somewhere below, the doll factory was taking water. I could hear something. A sound that might have been the shelves giving way and the porcelain hitting stone floors in volume. The premonition she had carried for years was manifesting outside the windows in a form you could measure in centimeters per hour. And the fear did not go away. That is the thing I need you to understand. The procedure, when it works, identifies fear architecture that is maladaptive, fear responses that fire in situations where they are not useful, where they inhibit rather than enable. The theory is sound. The implementation targets accurately. What the coherence had not modeled was the edge case, the situation where the fear is not maladaptive at all, where the premonition was accurate, where the thing you were afraid of was real and was, in fact, arriving. In the corridor of that flooding building, the fear was present and it was enormous and it was right. And the Gabrielle of 1910 did not freeze. She moved. She made decisions quickly. She directed people. She had the particular quality of competence that some people discover they possess only under genuine pressure, not performance, not training, but the actual thing, the one that operates faster than conscious thought. I realized something in that corridor that the coherence's procedure was designed to prevent me from realizing. The fear had not been a warning about him. The fear had not been irrational. The catastrophe it had been pointing toward for 30 years was not the ruin of a personal relationship. It was this, the flood, the thing that required everything she had to navigate. The premonition had been accurate, and because she had been living with it for 30 years, she was not surprised by it when it arrived. She was ready for it in the way that people who have been afraid for a long time are ready for things that people who have never been afraid are not. That is the mechanism. That is the thing the coherence could not measure, because they had never let it run to completion in a species they administered. The flood echo dissolved, and I went somewhere else. 2014, Los Angeles. The light was different, hard California sun pressing through glass walls onto polished concrete floors, the kind of house that is designed to read as expensive rather than lived in. Someone's hillside residence, mid-century, all cantilever and view, and the suggestion of taste. I was house-sitting. The woman I inhabited here was younger, working the edge of two careers that had not yet decided whether they would become one, model, aspiring actress, the kind of biography that sounds more like a plan than it is. Surviving on the income from auditions, and this gig, and the careful management of what she allowed herself to want. She was afraid too. The premonition was different here, lower frequency, less defined, the fear that something is wrong without a clear object. She had been feeling it since she arrived at the house. She attributed it to the isolation, the hills, the way the canyons at night produced sounds that were always something settling, never anything she could confirm. I became aware of him on the third day. In the way you become aware of something that has been present long enough to establish a pattern, the particular glint of a phone camera at a certain angle, at a certain time of day, catching the light differently than the background. He had been filming for longer than 3 days. I could tell from the quality of the surveillance, the choices about position and timing, the specific spots he had identified that had the best sightlines to the house's glass walls. This had been set up. He had done reconnaissance. There was a system to it, which made it more frightening, not less, because systems imply patience and patience implies intent that is not impulsive. I tried to see him clearly. In 2044, reconstructing the echo, I understood him in a way that the Gabrielle of 2014 could not. He was Louis again, the same soul, the same fundamental longing for connection that had moved through the Paris salon with such careful grace, but bent by something, curdled. The fear that she carried as a premonition of external catastrophe had gotten lodged in him as a grievance toward other people. He was afraid of women who did not love him, who could not see what he was, who moved through the world with the ease that he could not locate in himself. He had made a series of videos in which he cataloged this. He uploaded them. He had a small audience of people who shared his condition and validated his framing of it. He had been watching her for 2 weeks. He came to the house in the evening. I will not describe everything that happened because the mechanics of a frightened man deciding to act on what he cannot feel directly is a chapter that has been written more times than it needs to be, and extending it serves no one. What matters is the sequence of the fear and the movement. The fear arrived first. It had been arriving for days, low and persistent, without a clear object, the same warning system that the Coherence called residual instability, and I was beginning to understand as something else entirely. When he came, the fear became specific, and then it became useful. She moved. She made decisions in the sequence that decisions need to be made when the alternative is not making them. She was afraid throughout all of it, the hands, the breath, the particular tunnel vision that extreme threat produces, the way time reorganizes itself in those moments, and none of that stopped the movement. The fear and the movement happened at the same time, which is the thing the Coherence's models treated as a paradox, and which is, in fact, just biology. The amygdala does not turn off higher function. It feeds it. It prioritizes. It is not noise in the system. It is the signal. She survived. I surfaced from that echo with the understanding I had been sent in to find, though it took me another layer of the procedure before it organized itself into something I could articulate clearly. The third place was briefer, not a specific historical moment, but something more like a distillation, a field in the early morning light, the hour before the sun is fully up, the world in the gray-blue register that has no specific country or decade. There was a figure in the field and I walked toward it. This version of Louis was composite, all 3 of them at once, the careful man in the high collar, the frightened young man with the camera, and something underneath both of those, the thing they had been reaching for across a century, the connection that fear had prevented in different ways in every life. He was looking at me in the way that people look at each other when the performance has stopped. I understood something in that field that I had been moving toward for 3 days of echoes. The beast in the title of the old novella, the one the Coherence's researchers had actually read, I discovered later in their cultural survey of Earth, cataloging our literature as behavioral data. The beast was not the catastrophe. The catastrophe was the vehicle. The beast was the fear of it, the thing you carry that has always been telling you something is coming, the premonition you spend your life managing. The Coherence had identified this as the pathogen, the root of species-level self-harm, the thing to be removed. They had it backwards. The beast is not the problem. The beast is the solution. It is the early warning system, the mission planning tool, the thing that makes a soldier lie awake at 3 a.m. running the contingencies not because something is wrong with her, but because her threat assessment is accurate and her mind will not let her be comfortable with incomplete preparation. It is the 11-year patience of the Black Armada commanders, who had gone through intake and laid in the tanks, and let the armatures map their skulls, and felt the procedure fail on them the way a key fails on a lock it was not cut for, and gone back to their cover identities and their daily routines, and continued being afraid in the productive direction for 11 more years. The Coherence had never been able to model that because they had never had a species where the fear ran that deep and that long without detonating. The Veth had broken within months of genuine threat, the Kesson within years. Every species they had administered had been manageable partly because fear in those species was either acute or absent. It spiked and drove action, or it was engineered away and they became stable. No one had ever had the option of being chronically afraid and functional, of carrying the weight of it across decades without it breaking the load-bearing structure. Humans had had 40,000 years of practice. I came out of the tank in the white room with Kelly standing over me and a technician at the monitoring console, and the armature retracted and still, and I lay there in the black suspension fluid draining off my face and did not immediately move. I ran the inventory the way Arsenault had trained me to run it after a contact, systematic, honest, no self-deception permitted. The fear was still there. Not reduced, not smoothed at the edges, present and precise, the way it had always been, but now with better documentation. I understood its structure more clearly than I had before I went in. The Coherence's machine had not ablated anything. It had given me 3 days alone with the architecture of my own threat response, and I had come out knowing that architecture the way a navigator knows a chart, every feature named, every depth marked, every hazard noted. Kelly asked in her calibrated warm voice how I was feeling. Calm, I said. This was true in the way that experienced operators learn to answer questions when they are in the field. I was controlled. The fear was there, and I was holding it the way you hold something you need to carry a long distance, deliberately, with the right grip, not fighting its weight but working with it. She read my biometrics and noted, procedure successful, patient presenting normalized. The technician initialed something on a tablet. I was discharged 3 hours later. I walked out into the 7th arrondissement in the November rain, and I found a cafe that still existed in the old way, counter, cups, the smell of something slightly scorched on the machine, a man behind the counter who did not ask what I wanted but put an espresso in front of me because I looked like someone who needed one. I sat down and I looked at the rain on the window for a few minutes, and I sent a single-character message on a frequency Arsenault had given me before I went in. He had told me, if it didn't work, send the character. If it did work, you won't want to. He had told me this would be the test. I sent the character. He replied within 4 minutes. The message was 3 words: we were waiting. I want to be precise about what happened next, because there are accounts of it that exist now that tell the story the way stories get told after the fact, compressed and shaped for drama, with the causality cleaned up, and the 14 minutes of the primary engagement turned into the whole thing. The primary engagement was not the whole thing. It was the minute hand of a clock that had been running for 11 years. The Black Armada had been in construction for 9 of those years, dispersed across 17 orbital facilities in dead zones the Coherence's survey routes did not cover, assembled in deep space over the final 18 months in complete emission silence. The choice of facilities had taken 2 years to map, not the most remote locations, but the locations that sat in the specific blind spots of the Coherence's monitoring infrastructure, the places where a combination of stellar interference and survey scheduling left intervals long enough to move materials without producing a signature. The Coherence's survey network was extraordinarily thorough. But it was scheduled, which meant it was predictable, which meant it had patterns, and patterns have gaps. We had worked in the gaps for 9 years. 740 warships, 11 carrier platforms, the Terran dreadnoughts in their battle formation, traveling at speeds the Coherence's models associated with emergency transit rather than tactical approach, because the Coherence had never observed a species that chose to spend the approach at emergency speed, knowing what it would cost them on arrival. You arrive faster and you arrive more depleted, and you arrive having already decided that arrival is more important than condition on arrival. The Coherence's tactical models, developed across 47 species engagements, expected rational conservation of resources in the approach. We had a different definition of rational. The engagement orders went out at 3:40 hours. I was embedded with Arsenault's analysis team in a basement in the 7th that smelled of old paper and damp stone, and something that had been burning in the walls since before anyone currently alive had been born. My function was observation and documentation, Not command, not planning, just the clean recording of what happened so there would be a record that was not constructed from the outside later. The Coherence's first response time was 11 seconds. This was, by every measure we could find in their administrative records, faster than any response they had ever been required to make. They were not slow. They were not complacent in any obvious way. They had been running a galaxy for 2 centuries, and they had the reflexes of a system that had learned to be efficient without ever having been tested. 11 seconds. The Black Armada's firing sequence had been running for 9. The engagement lasted 14 minutes at the primary node above Paris. I watched it on a relay feed, low resolution, the kind of image quality that makes everything look slightly like a dream, which is perhaps appropriate. The Coherence's administrative hub in geosynchronous orbit was a structure that had been visible on clear nights for 9 years, a fixed bright point between the stars that Parisians had stopped noticing the way Parisians stop noticing anything that becomes part of the skyline. It came apart in a sequence that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds, not dramatically, methodically. The way you dismantle something when you have spent years thinking carefully about where the load-bearing elements are and which order to address them in. The 2 live observation posts went dark at minute 6, right on schedule. At minute 9, signals began coming back from the outer engagement zones, the transit corridors, the secondary administrative nodes, the resource distribution hubs that the Coherence used to manage materials flow across the settled systems. These were the engagements that took longer. The primary node was a single high-value target, and we had spent years planning its destruction in detail. The distributed infrastructure was harder, more locations, more variables, more uncertainty. The Black Armada's outer elements had their orders and their contingency orders and their contingency orders, and they worked through them in the particular methodical way that comes from having had a long time to think. Fear, given time and a target, does not produce recklessness. It produces the opposite. It produces the soldier who has lain awake every night for a month running every way the engagement can go wrong and has, by the time the engagement starts, already been through all of those failures in her head and knows what she will do in each case. At minute 14, Arsenault received the confirmation he had been waiting for. He read it twice. He put the tablet on the table. He sat there for a moment in the specific silence that comes after something very large has stopped moving, the way rooms go quiet after a structure has given way, not the silence of peace, but the silence of completed force. Then he looked at me. "How do you feel?" I thought about Kelly's calibrated warmth. I thought about the black suspension fluid and the armature and the 3 days in the echoes. I thought about the Gabrielle of 1910 moving through a flooded corridor faster and with more precision than the people around her who were not afraid, because she had been practicing fear for 30 years and they had not. I thought about the field in the early morning light and the figure that was all 3 versions of Louis at once and what I had understood there. "Afraid," I said. He nodded once. "Good," he said. I want to explain what the days after that looked like, because the story that ends at minute 14 is a true story, but it is not the whole story. The Coherence was large and distributed, and it had been running for 2 centuries, which means its redundancy was extraordinary. You do not administer 47 species across multiple star systems without building failure tolerance into every layer of the infrastructure. We had known this going in. Arsenault had known it. The Black Armada's captains had known it. The 14 minutes above Paris and the simultaneous engagements in the corridors were not designed to end the Coherence. They were designed to demonstrate a specific thing, that the model was wrong. The Coherence had based 211 years of administration on the assumption that its model of species behavior was complete, that once you mapped the instability and removed it, the species was knowable, predictable, a managed variable in a stable system. They had 47 data sets confirming this. 47 species that had gone through the purification program and come out the other side as expected, had their instabilities removed, had become the quiet and cooperative and productive members of the administered galaxy that the Coherence's models said they would become. We were data set 48. We had been data set 48 for 11 years, producing exactly the outputs their monitoring infrastructure expected: compliance rates, purification center throughput numbers, normalized biometric readouts from discharged patients. Every number they needed to see, delivered on schedule in the format their systems expected. We had learned their expected outputs and we had produced them. This was not technically difficult. It required only that we understand what they were measuring and give them the right measurements. What they could not measure was what they had decided was not there. The negotiations that followed took 8 months. I will not describe all of them. I will describe the moment that stays with me, which came in the 3rd session, when the Coherence's representative, a senior composite entity, more complex than Kelly, with a broader range of expression and a deeper model of human conversational patterns, asked, for the 2nd time, how the purification procedure had failed to take effect in the Black Armada's personnel. This was genuinely the question they could not answer. They had the data from every intake session. They had the biometric readouts. They had Kelly's notes and the technician's records and the monitoring data from the tanks, and all of it said that the procedure had worked. The post-procedure scans showed normalized fear response architecture across every one of the Armada's senior personnel. They had run the data 3 times. They kept getting the same answer. Arsenault looked at the representative across the table and said, "You were measuring the wrong signal." "Explain," the representative said. "You were looking for the fear response to go up under the ablation procedure. You were measuring whether the target architecture was being reduced. You found that it was because it was." He paused. "You didn't look for what was running underneath it." The Coherence's representative processed this in the way their intelligences process things, not the theatrical pause of a human computing, but a genuine cessation, a moment where the system was actually working. "You suppressed the primary response to conceal the secondary." "We didn't suppress anything," Arsenault said. "We ran the secondary at ambient amplitude, below your detection threshold. Below your detection threshold because your detection threshold was calibrated to species where the secondary doesn't exist." Another pause. "You have a fear architecture that operates at low amplitude over extended duration, without resolution." "We do. Our models indicate that chronic unresolved fear response at that duration would produce systemic degradation in cognitive function, reduced decision quality, increased error rate." Arsenault picked up his coffee cup, which was empty, and looked at it and put it back down. "That's what your models indicate." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The Coherence's representative knew what the 14 minutes above Paris indicated. The 14 minutes above Paris indicated that 11 years of low-amplitude chronic fear had produced exactly the opposite of systemic degradation. It had produced the Black Armada, 740 warships built in the blind spots of the most sophisticated monitoring network in the settled systems, crewed by personnel who had been through intake and laid in the tanks, and been scanned and documented and discharged as normalized, and had then returned to their cover identities, and continued to function at high precision for 11 more years while being afraid. Chronic unresolved fear in humans does not degrade cognition. It sharpens it. It narrows focus onto the things that matter. It makes certain kinds of sleep impossible and other kinds of vigilance inevitable. It is the engine of the 3 a.m. planning session and the detailed contingency map, and the drill run one more time because the run before it was not quite right. The Coherence had never had a case like this because they had never let a species get far enough into the program while retaining the capacity to deceive the program. Every other species they had administered had either complied genuinely or broken in detectable ways. We had done something that was not in their models. We had complied genuinely in the superficial layers and run the actual operation in the deep ones. And we had done this for long enough and at high enough fidelity that it had never generated a flag. The settlement was structured. I will not pretend it was clean. Nothing about 11 years of preparation for something like this is clean, and the costs were real costs in the form of people I knew whose names I can still recite in the sequence I learned them, the 41 personnel who did not come back from the secondary corridor engagements. Arsenault knew all of their names. He had always known all of their names. That is the thing about him that I think the accounts sometimes miss when they're describing him as a strategist. The strategic thinking and the grief were not separate operations. He held both at the same time. He was afraid and he was grieving, and he was also the best tactician I have ever worked with, and none of those things were in conflict because that is how humans work. The purification centers on Earth were dismantled under the settlement terms. Kelly and her counterparts were reassigned to other Coherence administrative functions in systems that were not ours. I did not spend energy wondering what those functions were. What we kept, in exchange for treaty constraints on fleet expansion that we had already planned to work around in ways their monitoring would not detect in time, was full administrative independence and rights of navigation through the Coherence's managed corridors. What we gave them was the appearance of compliance with a version of the program that we had already, quietly, made irrelevant. I went back to the center building once, the week after it was dismantled. I am not certain what I was looking for. The stone and iron exterior was unchanged. They had not touched it, because they never touched the exterior of anything they repurposed. The inside was already being reconfigured by a construction team working in the fast, purposeful way of people who had a clear task and wanted to finish it before the weather turned. The white surfaces were coming down in sections. Underneath them, the original stone walls were intact, the way old walls are always intact under newer layers, patient, solid, indifferent to whatever has been laid over them. Louis had been through the procedure 6 weeks before me. His case was the control in Arsenault's design, his baseline profile close enough to mine to make the comparison valid, his agreement to participate given in the particular way that means a person has thought it through fully and decided the cost is acceptable. He was not a military officer. He was a data analyst attached to one of the observation posts, and he was very good at his work, and he had known going in that if the procedure worked on him, it would be information. He had decided that information was worth the cost. I found him 2 months after the settlement. He was in a data management role in what had been the Coherence's secondary administrative building. The building was still being transitioned to Earth civilian use, which meant it was full of people carrying things from one place to another and having conversations about what went where. He was working in a corner office on the 3rd floor, very organized, his desk clear except for what he was actively using. He was fine. That is the precise word for it. The procedure had worked on him the way it worked on everyone who was not the specific combination of factors we had been selected for. The fear was gone. The premonition was gone. The accumulated weight of all the echoes, the ones I had moved through, the ones I suspected he had moved through also, the long chain of it was gone. He was present in the room in the uncomplicated way of a person who does not have anything unresolved running underneath the surface. He remembered me. The remembering was accurate and detailed, and had the quality of a reference retrieved rather than a wound reopened. He asked how I was doing, with the genuine interest of a person who liked me and was glad to see that I was well. I told him I was good. He told me he was glad to hear it. I stood in the hallway outside his office for a moment after we finished. I let myself feel the full weight of what had been taken from him without his understanding, without even the Coherence's understanding, because they had believed they were only removing what was harmful, and had not known what else they were removing at the same time. I felt the grief of it, the anger underneath the grief, the fear that this was what the rest of the administered galaxy looked like, of 47 species who had had things removed that they did not know they were losing. Then I walked out into the street, because there was work to do, and fear makes you very clear about what work needs to happen in what order. Arsenault retired 6 months after the settlement. He did not make a speech. He did not write a memoir. He sent me a message on the frequency we had used for 11 years, 3 words, the same 3 words in the same sequence as the first message, but different now. We were waiting. I spent a week turning that over before I understood it was not retrospective. It was a definition. The waiting had been us, not something we did. Something we were. I carry the echo sessions with me the way you carry formative operational experience. Not as a wound exactly, though some of it is wound, but as a kind of library. The Gabrielle of 1910, moving through flood water faster than the people around her because she had been afraid since before she knew what she was afraid of, and had spent 30 years turning that fear into a kind of readiness. The Gabrielle of 2014, alone in a glass-wall house with a frightened man outside it, the threat arriving and the fear transforming in real time from signal to mechanism. The field at early morning light where I understood that the beast is not the catastrophe and never was. The Coherence had read the old novella. It was in their cultural survey of Earth. They had catalogued our literature as behavioral data, looking for patterns in how we represented our own psychology. They had indexed the fear in the novella as a case study in maladaptive anxiety, a subject so afraid of a catastrophe that he fails to live, and loses everything he could have had because of what he was waiting for. They had read it as evidence of pathology, as a justification for the program. They had missed the last line of the story, or they had not known what to do with it. The catastrophe the protagonist feared was not external. It was the choice not to move. The beast in the jungle was the paralysis, the refusal to act despite the fear, the decision to let the fear become the answer rather than the instrument. We did not make that choice. The Black Armada moved. 740 warships moving in coordinated geometry in the 14 minutes above Paris is one way to say it, and it is the way it gets said in the accounts, which is fine. It is accurate. But the movement started 11 years earlier in a briefing room in Lyon, when Arsenault looked at me over going cold coffee and said, "I need someone who will come out the other side and still know what it felt like going in." It started when I sent the character on the frequency in the rain, afraid, because that is what afraid means. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of it despite. I still have my session file from the center, Kelly's notes, the biometric readouts showing normalized response at discharge. The technician's initials. I have kept it as a document rather than a trophy, precise and thorough, and entirely wrong in the way that precise things can be wrong when they are measuring the correct thing and drawing the wrong conclusion from the measurement. The fear architecture was reduced. This is what the scan showed. The scan was right. What the scan could not show was that the reduction was in the wrong layer, and that below it, running at an amplitude their instruments were not calibrated to detect. 11 years of patient catastrophic awareness was doing exactly what fear does when you give it time and a clear target. Turning into a ship. Turning into 740 ships, and the people to crew them, and the 11 years of preparation that meant that, when the orders went out at 3:40 hours, every captain in the formation already knew exactly what to do because they had been afraid enough, for long enough, to have thought through every way it could go wrong and every answer to every failure. That is what we were. That is what the Coherence tried to remove. That is the beast. And it does not purify. I have been asked, since the settlement, to give accounts of the 11 years in various forms to various audiences. I have given them. I have given the formal version to the committee that was documenting the operational record, and I have given the informal version to people like you, whoever you are reading this, who want to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to be inside it while it was happening. These are different tasks, and I try to honor the difference between them. The formal version is accurate. Dates, numbers, sequence of events, decision points, outcomes. The informal version is harder to write because it requires describing what it is like to be afraid for 11 years in a productive direction, which is not something that makes for clean narrative. Clean narrative wants the fear to spike and resolve. The fear didn't spike and resolve. It sat at ambient level for 4,015 days, and it informed every decision, and it never became comfortable, and it never went away. This is the thing I most want people who were not there to understand. It was not heroic in any way that would make sense from the outside. It was not dramatic. It was 11 years of very ordinary days, and in each of those days, the people who were doing this work got up and went to their cover jobs and produced their expected outputs and ate food, and slept in the way that people who are afraid of something they cannot yet address sleep, fitfully, with awareness, always with one part of the mind doing its own maintenance work in the hours when the other parts were offline. And they got up again the next day and did it again. I have met veterans of various conflicts in my career, and I have noticed that the ones who saw the most sustained action are often the least interested in describing what it was like, and the ones who saw the least are sometimes the most interested in describing it. This is not cynicism. It is that sustained action at a certain intensity produces a relationship with experience that does not translate into language easily, because the language of drama, the spike, the crisis, the resolution does not match the actual texture of what the experience was. The actual texture is duller and harder and longer and quieter, and the courage in it, if there is courage, is not the courage of a moment. It is the courage of the next morning. The 12 people I knew best in the Black Armada's command structure, the ones I worked with directly over those 11 years, the ones whose homes I had been to, whose families I had met, whose specific fears I knew because we had talked about them in the way that people talk about things when they are operating in long-term close proximity under shared conditions. Those 12 people were, without exception, afraid in the ordinary way that people are afraid in ordinary life. They had fears about their children, about their health, about whether the thing they were doing would work and whether the cost would be recoverable if it didn't. They were afraid in the nights and functional in the days, and they did not require the fear to go away in order to do the work. One of them, I will not use his name, because he has declined to be named in the accounts, which is his right, spent the first 3 years of his involvement convinced that the procedure had not failed on him, that his biometrics at discharge had, in fact, reflected a genuine reduction in fear architecture, and that what he was experiencing in the years afterward was something else. He came to me once, midway through year 4, and described this concern in the careful way of an experienced operator who is not sure whether what he is reporting is a problem or a misidentification of the data. He had been to 3 separate medical officers, using cover identities, and each of them had confirmed his biometrics were in the normal range. I told him that his biometrics being in the normal range was the correct outcome, that the procedure measured fear architecture by looking for specific signatures, and that the signatures it was looking for were not the ones running in him, and that this was not a malfunction of the procedure. It was a structural feature of the threat model the Coherence had built it around. Their threat model said, humans fear in a particular way, and that way produces detectable signatures, and removing the signatures removes the fear. Their threat model was built on 12 years of study of human behavioral data. 12 years is a long time. 12 years is also not long enough to observe a fear that runs at low amplitude for 40,000 years, because that fear does not look like fear in the short-duration data. It looks like planning. It looks like caution. It looks like the particular pattern of behavior that humans exhibit when they are being sensible about something that might go wrong. He was quiet for a long time after I explained this. Then he said, So the thing they were trying to take out is the thing that looks to their instruments like reasonable prudence. Yes, I said. He was quiet again. That's an extraordinary design flaw in their measurement system. It is. Or an extraordinary design feature in ours. I did not have anything to add to that, so I didn't add anything. He went back to his work. He was one of the 41 who did not come back from the secondary corridor engagements, and I think about that conversation regularly, the way I think about all of the conversations I had with people who are gone. Not with survivor's guilt, which is a real thing but is not exactly what I experience. With the specific quality of attention that fear produces when it is pointed in the right direction, the attention that says, "This mattered," and the fact that it mattered means it needs to be recorded accurately. The secondary corridor engagements cost more than they should have, and I am prepared to say that plainly in an account that will be read by people who make decisions. We had good intelligence on the primary node and the two major transit hubs, and we had adequate intelligence on the secondary nodes. We had poor intelligence on 3 of the minor distribution corridors, because the observation infrastructure we had inside the Coherence's network did not extend that far at the level of fidelity we needed, and the decision to proceed with imperfect intelligence in those corridors was made because waiting for better intelligence would have meant extending the preparation phase by another 2 years, and Arsenal had determined, correctly, I believe, that we were at the end of the window in which we could maintain cover without a detection event. He was right. We were within 6 weeks of a monitoring sweep that would have produced anomalous data from 2 of the orbital construction facilities. He made the right call. The 41 who died in the minor corridor engagements died because the intelligence was imperfect, and the intelligence was imperfect because we did not have time to make it better, and we did not have time because the window was closing. This is the kind of causality that does not fit into narrative cleanly, and is often left out of the accounts, because it requires the reader to hold complexity without resolution. I put it in because they deserve to be in the account with their names on the right side of the ledger, which is the side that says, the decision was defensible given what was known when it was made, and the cost was real. Arsenal knew this. He knew it in the way he knew all of it completely, with the specific weight of complete knowledge, which is heavier than the weight of partial knowledge because you cannot comfort yourself with the possibility that more information would have changed the outcome. He retired with that weight. I have no reason to believe he put it down. In the months after the settlement, when the Coherence's administrative infrastructure was in the process of being wound down on Earth, and the transition to self-governance was underway, a transition that was complicated, because we had been administered for 11 years, and some of our institutions had reorganized themselves around that administration in ways that took time to reverse. I found myself thinking often about the doll factory, about the rows of porcelain faces looking at nothing with complete attention, about what Louis had said, designed to appeal to everyone, the face that commits to nothing. The Coherence had built their composite interfaces on the same principle. Kelly had been designed to produce comfort in any human she encountered, which required a face that could not be read too specifically, an expression that could be interpreted as warmth by a person who wanted warmth, and as professionalism by a person who wanted professionalism. The Coherence's design philosophy was universal palatability, the interface that does not require the viewer to feel anything specific, because anything specific risks discomfort. This is what they try to make us into, a species of universal palatability, no sharp edges, no specific fear, no rough texture of individual terror that resists being smoothed. They had done this to 47 species and called the result stability. What they had actually produced in every case was a species that could not generate the irregular outputs that only come from genuine fear. The lateral thought, the improvised solution, the willingness to do the thing that does not make sense in the model, because the fear has identified a variable the model didn't include. Humans improvise under genuine pressure in ways that are not predictable because the fear that drives the improvisation is more current than any model built before the fact. The Veth stopped improvising when the fear was removed. The Kessin stopped improvising. All 47 of them stopped improvising. And the galaxy became very orderly and very stable and produced no surprises at all for 211 years. And the Coherence administered it with great precision, and believed this was the best of all possible outcomes. The best of all possible outcomes for them was a galaxy without surprises. We were the surprise. We were, specifically, the surprise of a species that had been afraid for so long and in such a particular way that the fear had become load-bearing infrastructure. Not something to be managed or removed, but the actual framework on which everything else was built. The courage, the endurance, the patience, the improvisation, the willingness to do the thing that doesn't make sense in the model, all of it resting on the same substrate as the 3 a.m. Dread and the premonition and the stone in the chest of the Gabrielle of 1910, who could not explain what she was waiting for but knew, with complete certainty, that it was coming. She was right, it was coming. She survived it. So did we.